The IRS has released some very important announcements. Millions of you guys can expect to receive some bonus relief payments this month.
And by the way, there are a lot of jobs coming to people that you're going to need to train up people, thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Everybody knew and you heard from my secretary a little bit earlier, America's falling behind in infrastructure.
But there is a deadline. Taxpayers have just a few weeks left to claim this money. And so, here is some big news. The IRS is sending refunds to more than 1 million Americans who filed their taxes late in the early days of the crisis. But there is a new deadline. The agency has announced that taxpayers have until September 30th to take advantage of this new relief. Typically, people who file their taxes late without requesting an extension can expect to pay penalties of up to 25% of the amount of taxes that they owe. For 2019-2020, however, the agency is suspending taxes or the penalty for those taxes for late filers. Taxpayers who have already paid a fine will automatically be given refunds, the IRS said. And more than 1.6 million people are set to receive refunds or credits totaling $1 billion. This is an average of $700 per person. Although some of you guys may get more and some may get less. The IRS said taxpayers who have already filed their returns don't need to do anything. If you've been notified of a fine but have not yet paid it, the penalty will be erased, and while those who have already paid the penalty will receive a refund or credit, most of the refunds will be delivered by the end of this month. So that's some good news to look forward to. And according to the IRS, taxpayers who have yet to file returns for 2019 and 2020 can still have penalties forgiven, as long as their returns are filed by September 30th, 2022. That gives late filers just over 2 weeks to wrap up outstanding returns. Now the effort is to move to help struggling taxpayers affected by the crisis, and the plan can also help the agency, which is struggling to dig itself out of a massive backlog of unprocessed tax returns. In a notice, the IRS said the crisis had an unprecedented effect on the tax agency, highlighting the agency's roles in distributing stimulus payments and taking other steps to help taxpayers weather the crisis. Dropping late filing penalties could also benefit the IRS by helping the agency focus on whittling down its backlog of tax paperwork and returning to normal for the 2023 tax season. Several House Democrats are facing tough re-election bids, as well as one congressional hopeful, and they are defending their party's expansion of the IRS that was included in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which does little to immediately address inflation in America. The measure, backed by Joe Manchin, successfully passed through Democrat-controlled chambers last month and was signed by President Biden. It will grant an $80 billion boost to the IRS over a 10-year period. The billions of dollars for the IRS from the measure will go towards filing 87,000 IRS positions, Social Security beneficiaries. Rising inflation also means more retirees will end up being taxed on their benefits, and when Congress introduced Social Security taxation in the 1980s, it set income thresholds and avoided indexing them for inflation. On the positive side of this, retirees whose costs are rising more slowly than the official inflation figures will benefit from the latest cost of living adjustments, according to the U.S. Labor Department. And Bernie Sanders and Peter DeFazio have introduced the Social Security Expansion Act, which would, among other measures, boost benefits, adopt the Consumer Price Index for the elderly, and subject all income above $250,000 to the Social Security payroll tax. However, Democratic Representative John Larson has also proposed a Social Security reform bill. His bill adopts the CPI index for the elderly as the basis of the annual COLA and applies the payroll tax to annual wages above $400,000. Experts say that Larson's bill includes more benefit improvements than the DeFazio-Sanders bill, but DeFazio-Sanders extends solvency for significantly longer than the John Larson bill. Now everybody, officials are warning Americans of a global food shortage. The Biden administration is working to address several issues that the American people are currently facing. During the crisis, Americans across the country got a little extra help from stimulus checks, but for most of us, it's been a while since one has hit our bank accounts. And Georgia's governor recently signed Bill 1302, which is a new law attempting to offset the rising cost of
We need to go to $2,000. I didn't say he was a visionary. He's right on this issue.
You know, obviously Speaker Pelosi, Senator Chuck Schumer, the Treasury Secretary debated this with Republican leadership for a long time. They cut a deal with a $600 stimulus check. Did they just waste their time and cut a lousy deal?
Well, look, when you look at a deal, you have to look at it within the context of the problems that we face.
Lindsey Graham told ABC News, "I will vote against it," referring to the government funding, and he said he was urging his Republican colleagues to do the same. it's not yet clear whether Republicans will unite behind Graham's efforts, but most GOP aides familiar with the matter say they do not expect that. Throughout the crisis, the American government has sent out rounds of stimulus payments, first under the former president and now with President Biden. But most stimulus checks were sent as electronic checks to bank accounts. But when the IRS didn't have a recipient's direct deposit information, they mailed paper checks. So like all payment checks sent from the Treasury, if these checks are not cashed within 1 year, they expire. And that's good news. You can request a new one if you have a check that expires. Approximately 9 million people in the US, 9 million US citizens that is, live overseas. Stimulus payments worth $5.5 billion were sent to more than 1/3 of those expat soldiers and world travelers. There is a $1,400 fourth stimulus payment. The IRS has released a new announcement that for all taxpayers that have received the stimulus checks, that have received the stimulus cash. With tax day well behind us, millions of Americans are still waiting for the refunds. Some have already been waiting for several months for the federal income tax refunds to arrive after completing paper returns and mailing them in late January or early February. As of August, the IRS has had around 8 million unprocessed individual tax returns. Of them, 1 million returns contain errors or require special handling, while 6.5 million are paper returns that still must be reviewed and processed. In its latest update, the agency said that this is a mix of returns for 2021 and late file returns for the previous tax years. The IRS says it's essentially been unable to process the 2022 returns until it finishes processing all the 2021 returns. So before the crisis, the IRS typically delivered refunds to paper filers within 4 to 6 weeks. However, over the past year, refund delays tied to paper filings have generally exceeded 6 months. While doing taxes can be stressful, the process can be satisfying once a return hits your account. The good news is that the IRS has to pay interest on any money it owes you, so your tax refund comes from your 2021 return, and the IRS is required to start paying interest on overpayment 45 days after accepting a tax return. To determine the status of your return, you can use the IRS Tax Refund Tracker, which will also let you know if your return has been rejected by the IRS because of errors. If you filed a proper return and you did it on time and the IRS does not issue your refund within 45 days, the agency is required to start paying interest on your refund amount. As of July 1st, the IRS inflation
Senator Van Hollen of Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and great to see you, Mr. Chairman. Great to see an SEC chairman from the great state of Maryland.
It's great to see my senator.
Yeah, right. Let me just pick up on the first point that Senator Kennedy raised in terms of implementation of the Holding Foreign Countries Accountable Act. I just want to thank you and your team for pursuing that. I also agree we should shorten the time period to 2 years, and I want to thank Senator Kennedy for his work on this. The idea, of course, was to make sure we protect American investors, especially smaller